Hey there, and welcome to today's Explainer. Whether you're an 8th grade history student or just someone who loves digging into America's past, you are in the exact right place. Today, we're diving deep into a truly monumental chapter in U.S. history, the era of Reconstruction. Honestly, the best way to think about this era is like a massive, super ambitious attempt to build a bridge. We're talking about a bridge stretching from a deeply fractured, war-torn past straight toward a unified, equal future. It was a time of literal and figurative rebuilding, right after the Civil War. And the whole thing centered around one incredibly powerful concept: American citizenship.
So imagine this. What happens when a war finally ends, but the fight for who actually gets to be a citizen has just begun? Because, the cannon fire of the Civil War might have stopped in 1865, but the ideological battle? No way. That was far from over. The end of the war actually sparked this fierce, deeply complicated new debate over what freedom truly meant on the ground and who had the right to call themselves a true citizen of the United States.
To understand how all this played out, let's take a quick look at our agenda for today. First, we'll cover competing plans for Reconstruction. Second, redefining citizenship with amendments. Third, the rise of Black leadership. Fourth, violent resistance and backlash. And finally, the unfinished struggle. This roadmap is going to help us trace the blueprints, the construction, and the ultimate challenges of that unfinished bridge to equality.
All right, let's jump right into part one, competing plans for Reconstruction. We'll start by looking at how different leaders completely disagreed on how to rebuild the nation in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War.
So, following the tragic assassination of President Lincoln, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, suddenly takes over, and Johnson proposes this highly lenient plan to reintegrate the Confederate States. Basically, he provides pardons to Southerners en masse and offers a really quick, easy path back into the Union. But here's the crucial cause and effect relationship you've got to understand. President Johnson's quick, lenient pardons caused a direct, massive reaction from a group in Congress known as the Radical Republicans. They completely disagreed with this soft approach. They demanded much stronger intervention, pushing to actually bring law and order to the South through the use of military force and martial law.
And this whole situation brilliantly illustrates the intense tension of the era. The conflict between the president and the Republican-controlled Congress just escalated rapidly. While President Johnson pretty much concluded that everything needed to stabilize the South was already done, Congress forged ahead on their own. In fact, this political friction was the very catalyst for Congress basically taking the reins of Reconstruction. They overrode Johnson's vetoes specifically because they wanted to ensure that freed people were actually extended real citizenship and equality before the law.
That brings us to part two, redefining citizenship with amendments. Let's see how these radical Republicans laid down the permanent steel beams of our constitutional bridge by redefining exactly what it meant to be an American.
To do this, they fundamentally altered the U.S. Constitution with 3 major amendments, passed in really rapid succession. Visually mapping this out chronologically, we see the 13th Amendment right at the end of the war in 1865, then the 14th Amendment ratified in the late 1860s, and finally the 15th Amendment adopted by 1870. Together, these 3 additions completely evolved the entire definition of American citizenship.
Now, historians constantly claimed that radical Republicans completely transformed the Constitution, and the absolute best evidence for this is found right here in the exact text of the 13th Amendment, by clearly stating that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. This amendment legally and permanently abolished the institution of slavery that had fractured the country since its very founding.
Next came the 14th Amendment, and listen, this one connects directly to you and me today. It states, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens. Before this, citizenship was incredibly contested and restricted. The 14th Amendment provided the ultimate, expansive definition of who gets to be an American, guaranteeing equal protection of the laws to everyone within its jurisdiction. It was a real game changer. And finally, we have the 15th Amendment. The text here reads, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This was a monumental leap forward, specifically meant to guarantee political power and voting rights for Black men who had just been granted that citizenship. Okay, let's do a quick pause check here. We know the 15th Amendment guaranteed voting rights regardless of race, but based on the historical source material we're looking at, how do you think the 15th Amendment impacted the women's suffrage movement at the time? Take a second to just reflect on the ripple effects of this major change.
Well, the crucial point here is that while the 15th Amendment was a massive victory for Black men, it explicitly disappointed female suffragists. Women had labored for years alongside abolitionists to gain the right to vote, but the 15th Amendment completely left out the word sex. This provides us with immediate reasoning of how history is often, deeply complex. A massive step forward for one group left another group still waiting at the edge, totally unable to cross that bridge to full political participation.
Which smoothly brings us to part 3, the rise of black leadership. Now, what's genuinely fascinating about this next phase is what happened right when the 15th Amendment went into effect on the ground.
The direct effect of these new amendments was just transformative. Empowered black voters made incredibly good use of their newly protected right to vote. I mean, for the first time in American history, freedmen were legally casting ballots, and they elected black politicians to local, state, and even federal offices all across the South. People were finally crossing that bridge into true political leadership and representation.
Time for our second pause check. We've talked about the amendments, we've seen the new leadership. To make sure we are actively tracking the big picture here, according to the historical claims we've covered so far, what was the overarching primary objective of the entire Reconstruction era?
The answer is to create an interracial democracy that provided equal rights to all citizens. Historians note this was the primary objective because, actually, it wasn't just about putting the country's map back together. It was much bigger. It was about building a totally new, equitable society that had quite literally never existed before in the United States.
Moving on to part 4, violent resistance and backlash. As you probably know, in history, every major action almost always triggers a massive reaction. And this time, it was a coordinated, violent attempt to dynamite the very bridge that was just being built. The civil rights efforts launched by radical Republicans generated a massive, severe backlash in the South throughout the 1870s. White Southerners fought intensely against this new political reality, pushing back against what they subjectively considered, in the exact words of the time, Negro misrule. They actively mobilized and sought to dismantle the new interracial democracy to redeem the South from Republican leadership. So let's look at how these compounding causes led to the ultimate collapse of Reconstruction. It was basically a perfect storm. First, you had the terrifying emergence of paramilitary terrorist cells committing atrocities just to suppress black voters. Second, a severe national economic depression hit, which abruptly shifted the whole country's attention away from civil rights and toward sheer financial survival. And third, a series of political scandals hobbled the Republican Party, completely weakening their ability to enforce equality. Collectively, these forces steadily eroded the fragile foundations of the Reconstruction effort. And that brings us to our final section, Part 5, the unfinished struggle. Because the collapse of Reconstruction didn't just end an era and fade away, it left a lasting, highly complicated legacy that we are honestly still navigating today. By 1875, the political will for Reconstruction had largely run out. The final cause and effect sequence happened with the highly contested presidential election of 1876. To resolve this huge disputed election, a backroom political compromise was made, and that resulted in the complete removal of federal troops from the South. Without the military stationed there to enforce the new constitutional amendments, the federal attempt to protect equality in the South officially ended.
So, to quickly recap, Reconstruction was a time of massive contradictions. The undeniable successes were the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. They literally embedded the blueprint for equality and citizenship directly into the U.S. Constitution. But the profound failures included the inability of the government to actually sustain that interracial democracy or stop the paramilitary violence that suppressed it. The bridge to equality was brilliantly designed and written into law, for sure, but the actual crossing of it was left tragic and unfinished.
Before we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative transfer question to ponder. If the constitutional amendments of Reconstruction, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, failed to fully guarantee equality and voting rights on the ground at the time they were passed, how do you think those exact same amendments are used to protect citizens' civil rights today? Think about the incredible long-term legacy of those words. Thank you so much for joining me for this focused look at Reconstruction, and hey, keep asking great questions.